Hello and welcome to Practical Intuition with Kay. This is the show where we are always working to help you choose for yourself and do what feels right for you. And I'm excited because I think this is one of the ones that feels really quite relevant to that. Not that they don't all, but this one, I don't know, has a special resonance, I guess, for me. I am Kay, and I'm glad you're here. I am a coach, a good listener. I am an artist. I'm a through hiker who used to need a wheelchair, and I'm the author of the memoir Waking Up, which is about the journey from one to the other, from wheelchair to through hiker. And my motto is always forward, never straight, which comes from a friend. That was a friend's motto, and I just love it. Um, and I'm really excited to have you here. Welcome. And thank you for being here along on this ride with me. We're doing something we've never done on this show before. We are going to read a book together. And the book that I've chosen is a really special one for me personally. But it's also, I think it's really interesting because one of the questions that came up is, well, okay, let me tell you what the book is. Today we'll be talking about chapters 1 and 2 of the Relationship Handbook, a simple guide to satisfying relationships by George Pransky, who is a therapist, and just such an interesting person. The version of this book that I have of the Relationship Handbook is the 25th anniversary. And there are some, and I actually, up until as I'm recording this in real time, which is Monday, the 30th of September, my paperback copy isn't here yet. It won't get here till tomorrow, which I think is kind of um, interesting because it meant that I was preparing for today in a different way than I have ever prepared for anything, to be discussing something written, which is to say that I listened to the recording of the audiobook. And in the recording of the audiobook, there are like these addendums that are part of the 25th anniversary edition. And some of those are read by George's wife, Linda. And Linda and George have created together I believe it's called Pransky and Associates, something like that. They certify people in therapy, and they're now, I mean, this book was written 25 years ago, plus whatever the time between now and when the 25th anniversary was published. So we're probably talking 30 or more years ago. And it was revolutionary for me when it first came into my life, which is in the last couple years. Um, for more reasons than one, right? Like, so the book is really written and looked at as like a lot of what they talk about in the book is about couples, right? So marriage partners, significant others, people in relationships in a like a partnership kind of long-term relationship. And what I started to notice was that this is a useful exploration of all relationships. It really was wonderful for to read, um, and to think about human dynamics and human relationships. And uh, a question that has come up is like there are a million books on relationships, right? There's a million therapy books, there's a million self-help books for couples, or even, parents and kids, or there's like a million sort of human dynamic kind of guidebooks or whatever. Like, why this one? And as I was re-listening to chapters 1 and 2 and also the prologue, I was really reflecting on that. And here's why. It is a complete departure from anything I'd ever learned before, or, was invited to practice as a teacher, um even as a coach, like holding space for people. This book was revolutionary for me because it is all about, well, we'll get into it. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm excited for today. Yeah, so some practicalities. The book is available in all formats. And like there are even copies of it available at a place called betterworldbooks.com, which is, I believe it's betterworldbooks.com. You can get it out of your local library, although I have to say I did not find it in my library system here in Eastern Massachusetts. But that's not to say maybe it is in your library system, or they would purchase it if you had asked for it, right? Like I know our library will buy things sometimes that I would recommend, so that might be a possibility. But it's available. Better World Books, the copy that I saw, or a copy that I saw yesterday, was like $6 or something. So, um, and then there's in Amazon, you can find it in ebook format. You can find it as a paperback. You can find it as an audiobook, which is how I've been utilizing it for these last several years. Um, so hopefully easy, relatively easy to get your hands on. You don't necessarily even have to I think it will mean a lot more to you if you have read it or if you are reading along with us, but that's not to be said that you couldn't just listen and get it later or something like that if you want, right? And so today we're talking about chapters 1 and 2 primarily. We'll talk a little bit about the prologue. And for the next time, for when we're reading again for the episode that comes out the third Tuesday in October, we will be reading chapters 3, 4, and 5. So that will be, that's for future reference if you are reading along with us. And I will be taking questions. So if you've got any, as you're reading or as you're listening, even jump in with questions, right? So you can find me at We Turned Out Okay, OKAY, in Instagram. You can find me in LinkedIn by searching K Lock Culp. Actually, I believe you can also do that in Instagram. K Lock Culp will find me. You can email me. It's the letter K, right? So K at klockculp.com. Before the at is simply the letter K. So it's not my whole first name. And I'd love either as you're reading or if you're thinking about joining us, on this, if you've got questions, if you've got comments, I'm happy to share them on the show. As I say, I've never done anything like this before, but I think it could be a lot of fun to engage with you as you're reading. And yeah, so that's kind of the nuts and bolts of this. Let's jump in. Yay. So, one word that comes up in the book a lot, and I have this right at the top of my notes for the Relationship Handbook, is I feel like a really powerful word, and the word is innocently. So, as you're going along reading or listening, if you happen to also be utilizing the audiobook, let your ears perk up at that word. It's quite an interesting one. They talk a lot about how we human beings do things innocently and don't understand the effect that something that we've done, innocently might impact somebody else. Um, and how the people that we know and are in relationships with, something that we do innocently might impact them uh, that we didn't realize like would have that effect. And also it works in the reverse direction, right? So somebody doing something innocently that affects us. And I think there's a lot of invitations overall in the book to have an understanding of why someone might being curious about why someone might say or do something because we can be up in our heads about it, and the invitation, feel like with the word innocently, is to just notice that and be open to the possibility that maybe there's something else going on than what we had thought. And if I'm thinking of, so an example that really comes up for me in my experience, when I was first discovering that I had ADHD or that I was suspecting that I had ADHD, and someone I'm close to, I shared that with. And this is someone who has spent decades working with young people, really, really experienced educator, doing really interesting things sort of in the realm of like courts and stuff right now. And what they reflected back to me was, wow, if so, you must be really high functioning as a person with ADHD. And I remember the clanging that went off in my head about that because it felt to me like what this person was saying was, uh, you're wrong. Like to me, you don't look like you have ADHD. Like how could you think you have that when you're not acting or being like that to me? And so they said something totally innocently that I took in a way that I'm sure was not intended. And when I was able to, this took months, by the way, this process, but when I was able to kind of settle down about that in my own mind, I could realize that what they were doing was they were sharing their thoughts on how I act and show up in the world, nothing to do with how I felt inside. Like that wasn't part of the conversation at all. It was really like, wow, you look like a person who's handling this well, who's, coping, who's sort of showing up in the world in a way that is perhaps helpful or kind or useful. And so their comment had nothing to do with my, and if I think about like the tone of voice, right, the body language around when they said that, it was not intended to upset or criticize or even put me in any category whatsoever. But I took it that way. And so that's an example of something innocently said that had an interesting impact. So, yeah, the word innocently comes up a lot in here. And that felt worth mentioning. In the prologue of uh, of the Relationship Handbook, so George, I'm just going to start calling him George because I don't know, you feel like there's a human being behind the words. Like you can really feel that writing. And in fact, if you happen to listen to the audiobook, uh, it's read by George's brother. And what I love about it is they must have grown up somewhere near where I did in Eastern Massachusetts, because they sound like actually, I've been reflecting on this. Uh, there's one particular teacher that I really loved and connected with in high school. He was my accounting teacher, and at least once every couple of weeks, he would say, "You know what? We're not gonna talk about accounting today." And he would sit on it. He would come around and he would sit or lean, on the front of his desk, and he would just talk about like important things, like like if you want to be in business, this important principle, and if you want to live a happy life, this important principle. And like he was a really special dude and really brought his whole heart to his work. And I felt that. And when I'm listening to George Pransky's brother read the audiobook, that is exactly the feeling that I have. In fact, I've been thinking about it like he sounds like every teacher I ever had in high school. But really, he sounds like one that had a lot of impact on me. So I think that's a special thing for me. So if you're listening to the audiobook, you know, you like you're taken in a way that is more than clinical. Like this isn't a bunch of how-tos or task lists or even, I mean, the theory is really well written and clearly written so that you can experience it or take it in like as a regular person. And so George spends time in the prologue talking about how he and his wife were really unhappy. They had an unhappy marriage, even though they were both therapists and counseling folks in their marriages. And he talks about the experience of, I'm not sure if his wife Linda went with him to this, but he went to a conference um, given by a person named Sydney Banks, who was the originator of this kind of therapy that George and Linda practice. Now, they hadn't practiced it then when they went to this conference. So they go, or at least George does. And in the audience are many happy couples. And George is reflecting, like, have you ever seen any happy couples in a room? Like, how many happy couples? There were so many at this particular conference. And um that was really curious to him. And so the model that Sydney Banks used and that the Pranskys have, I would say, adopted and also perhaps adapted. I'm not that familiar with Sydney Banks's work, but it sounds like this is work that they've taken in, sort of a longer route or more down this path of certainly for therapy than you know was given to them initially, maybe even just in the extensive work that they've done, right? And they started doing things the way that Sydney Banks was teaching and learning from Sydney Banks, and discovered that not only were these principles great for others, they worked for them too. So the addenda in this book, the sort of appendix, and then the work in that they share in there is all about them and their own marriage. And as I say, some of them Linda reads, which is really cool to hear in audio. Um, and so the prologue is really, you're taken in not with promises about, how this is going to change your life. You're taken in a really warm and vulnerable way about how this has changed the author's life and the people that he's worked with. And I think they talk about how there's this continuum. Well, this is how I've come to see it. Like in the prologue, what happens is we're sort of given the understanding that the things that like the emotions that come up, the frustrations that come up, the fights that happen, the communication, whether it's good or not good, all those things are happening along a continuum. And the continuum is from insecurity to security. So, in other words, the communication, the feelings that we have towards, the person that we're in, whatever, and again, whatever relationship this is, whether it's spousal or partnership, whether it's parent or child or friend, like all of these, relationships are, you can see them along this spectrum, right? From secure to insecure. And the ways that we show up in the relationship change depending on how secure or insecure we are feeling. So our communication will be different if we're feeling more secure or less secure. So will the emotions that we have inside and feel inside. So will how we express those emotions, because that's something that I've come to believe is, and really see reflected in all of my work, in 3+ decades now of education and of coaching, that emotion, what we're feeling, even if we don't know it, is the root of our behavior, right? So I think that's absolutely fascinating, and it really squares with this idea that every expression of emotion or communication is expressed how we're feeling secure or insecure in a given relationship. Um, yeah, so that's really the prologue, is sort of an invitation to think of this. First of all, we're told about it from a really personal perspective, and then the idea that like security or insecurity is the measure. And then we hop into chapter 1, which is called A Fresh Start. And I think like what I'm trying to do is really share my own learning and takeaways from the reading. Um, yeah, and I think I'll just start there and we'll see where we go. Always inviting your comments, which I'm really happy to read out when we get to, the next of these episodes and the next and the next. We're doing this, by the way, through the end of 2024. So there will be, I believe, at least 6 episodes um, about the Relationship Handbook. Uh, so chapter 1, A Fresh Start, really dives into what feelings really are. Like uh, George refers to them as a barometer. They're a barometer that tells what our emotional state is, right? And that's all they are. Like, I love this. It's a very, as an artist, when I'm looking at an image that I have created, I can evaluate it in a really impersonal, objective way, which is always going to be the way that makes me feel okay about it, right? That I can put down any defensiveness that I might have had or whatever and just be comfortable and happy evaluating the art for its strength, right? Like, does it have a particular journey through that will bring the viewer through the picture? Does it have dark values that will ground the painting and make it so that someone feels like the objects in it aren't sort of floating or stuck on or whatever. Is there some sort of relationship between the sky and what's happening on the ground if I happen to be doing a landscape? Like these are things that have absolutely nothing to do with my emotions or how I'm feeling about the painting. But I can look at a painting and feel an emotion about it. And that is simply a barometer for my emotional state. Like I can look at the same, just last night, I made some progress on a painting of dahlias. And I was so thrilled with it when I went to bed. I thought it was I painted it dancing to a playlist that I made up called Groovy 70s Music or something like that. Groovy 70s dance hits. And I was literally dancing and singing as I made it. And my emotional state was really quite high last night. And in a good way, you know what I mean? And then I headed off to bed and I got up this morning and um I was knocked off that a little bit. Like something came up in me that was making me feel less in a positive mood. And sure enough, I looked at this painting earlier today and I was like, good God, what have I done? This is hideous. And as my mood, this is the other message that pervades this book is like our mood changes. Like it simply does. It's like the weather a little bit. It comes and goes. And yes, there are things that we can do to influence that, but mostly what it is about recognizing what mood we are in, and our emotions are a really great barometer for that. So that happens in chapter 1 that we learn that. Also, I think as part of this fresh start that George wants to communicate in this chapter, it's about being able to maybe put down, I think maybe the way that I would think of it is putting down thoughts about uh, coping with someone or kind of putting up with something and someone in any relationship, right? It's about the ability instead of that, like what the work is, and it's as we'll talk about, it's fairly effortless work. It's simply noticing and being aware. Um, it's not so relationships and when we encounter challenges in them, it's not about coping with that or putting up with it or any negative feelings, really. It's much more about the ability to do what George calls keeping your bearings, just staying close, or feeling this person's heart, as opposed to being upset by an action or a behavior or something like that. Like keeping your bearings is really what it's about, and staying close to the person. The overarching theme is about how we're conditioned to approach the challenges that come up in relationships from a place of low mood. So, like, I don't know how true this is today, but George, as a therapist, was taught before Sydney Banks and before he learned how to do this kind of therapy, he was taught that what you do is you ask people to talk about the problems, like and so then they list the problems, and then everybody's feeling unhappy now. Like what we're doing is we're focusing on the problems, and it's not that you pretend there are no problems, right? It's not that at all. It's more like you recognize that what this is what I said. What if instead we could focus on letting go of that and highlighting not the problems or the challenges, but our thinking on them, like understanding that our thinking is what is hard about a challenge. Like we can always think about something differently. We could bring our attention to understanding what a mood is and how it influences our decision making. And I was recently in a conversation with one of my kids, and we got to talking about cynicism. And I thought this was so interesting. I don't have permission to share this story, so I can't really get into what their version of kind of cynicism is or like how they think of it. Um, but it was such a productive and fascinating conversation to hear about how someone, thinks about their own uh, thoughts and what they, their reflections on the system inside through which they regulate themselves emotionally and what when thoughts come up, what they mean. I was absolutely fascinated with it. And um, I shared that after, kind of listening and understanding what this person was sharing with me. I asked if it was okay to share my thoughts. And really for me, what it is cynicism is I know that when something's cynical either comes out of my mouth or comes up in my thoughts, it's not that they never do. It's to be curious about where did that thought come from? And in this case, I'd been reading some fiction, and it's actually a really great series and story. So in 2009, before 50 Shades of Grey came out, a completely different book in a totally different genre called Shades of Grey came out by one of my favorite authors. His name is Jasper Fforde. He's written all the Thursday Next novels. If you've ever read any Thursday Next, those are so good too. The first one of those is called The Air Affair, and it has to do with the policing, the, the police force that is existing inside of books. So, like, just to give you an idea of the genre, right? And this particular book, that 50, not 50 Shades of Grey, but just called Shades of Grey, is about a society, a dystopian society that is completely regulated by what color your eyes can see. And everybody's eyes see only one color, or only, like, for example, they'll see a blend of purple, a blend of blue and yellow, a blend of blue and yellow such that makes green, for example. Um, and one of the main characters sees only red. Like, that's they see other colors as gray. It's not red, not any other colors, right? And the whole society is regulated by this characteristic. So, like, the social hierarchy is all about who can see the most of what color, and the prefects are all chosen, like the sort of peacekeepers in a living place are all chosen by that. And I mean, we look at it and it's nuts. It's completely absurd, right? Anyway, I am now the long-awaited sequel in 2024. So how many years is that later? 15 years later. 2009, 2019. Yes, 15 years later. Came out. It's called Red Side Story. These are also really quite funny and very well done. So anyway, I'm a little ways into this, and I was reading a section of it that did have me feeling extremely cynical. And so when my son said what he said, I came back with a totally cynical response, completely almost unaware of that. And that's how we got into this really interesting conversation. And I realized a little later that the reason that I was, feeling that way was because I was so in the book and I had just read something that I found very disturbing and kind of upsetting. But I saw it, the reason it was really kind of disturbing and upsetting was because it reflected so clearly on the absurdity of how this society is built. And who does that serve? And I was absolutely fascinated with it. So anyway, cynicism for me is, you know, it's one of those emotional uh, barometer, parts on the barometer that shows where my mood is. And what I have learned simply is to recognize it and to not make any decisions until the mood passes. And then I can choose to do some things, right, to help it pass, that don't engage it, but, like, can I meditate? Can I dance? Can I go for a walk? Can I do some painting? Can I um cook something, or eat something, or hydrate, or go to bed, or, like, lots of very positive self-care ways to allow an emotion to shift. And but that's all cynicism was for me in that moment, was a mark on the barometer to show me what my mood was. And knowing that I'm going to recognize that and, for example, not make any decisions from a cynical place, it has worked really, really well. And the way that George says, the way that he kind of sums it up is he says, we can't enjoy anything while our minds are analyzing and criticizing. And like that's exactly what my mind was doing in that cynical moment. It was analyzing and criticizing, right? So he talks about how the book is all about a way to be in a healthy psychological state. Um, and that's it's funny too, because what's coming up now is reference to another book that I've heard of but have not read called Bad Therapy, which is sort of written by a therapist. And it sounds like the premise is about our default has shifted a little bit to an assumption that like, I haven't read it, so I can't say this for sure, but it sounds like the therapist is suggesting that like so many of us think we're broken now and that we cannot exist without therapy. Um, I mean, I want to say this therapy has been a tremendous benefit for me and for lots and lots of people that I've known. Um, I think I think what comes up in me is like, is there a moment at which you're good and you're okay and you can choose to uh what are the factors that would help someone choose to, for example, not continue with therapy or to choose to feel okay? And it's fascinating because like you don't hear a lot about healthy psychological states. Again, this was why I chose this book. Like, how wonderful to have a book that is practical and that helps us feel in a healthy psychological state in our relationships and within ourselves, right? Um, and the last thing I'll say about chapter one is something that's been really super helpful for me to remember in all my relationships. George talks about how everyone has in them a Dr. Jekyll and a Mr. Hyde. So this book was written a really long time ago, and um, he talks too. This is actually coming up too. He talks about germ theory and how before human beings knew what germ theory was, we did a lot of things that made us sick because we didn't know what it was that was passing germs, right? And he kind of talks about it like he talks about this sort of practice in terms of interpersonal relationships as the same. Like once we know how to do it, we won't go back and do the other because the other felt unhealthy, was unhealthy. So we staying in this place where we understand that emotions are simply a barometer of the mood that we're in, and knowing that our emotional state changes, and knowing that people do things innocently, and there's more than one way to interpret how something has been presented to us or how we show up for others. Like it's absolutely fascinating, right? And healthy to be in a healthy psychological state. So he talks about the book Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde a little bit because what he references is we all have inside us the capacity to be a sort of positive Dr. Jekyll or a more negative Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Yes, that's I don't think I've read that book, but anyway, I know the premise, which is that this one person sort of has two personalities, and depending on uh, which personality he is feeling at the moment, he is doing either very good things or not so good things. So, what George says at the end of the chapter is, it only takes one Jekyll. Like, it doesn't, I don't have to be dependent on the people around me to change for me to feel okay, is what this means. I can change how I think about my relationships, about my own emotions, about what's going on for others, about where I'm coming from, about my perspective, right? And that's what makes the difference. And I'll tell you, I have seen this in many of my personal relationships, like basically all of them are different now because I'm a different person. Um, I used to give it a lot of unsolicited advice, for example, that people didn't want and didn't need, and that made them feel upset and angry. And there's at least one of those examples that I was given permission to share about on this show, and that was pretty soon after my second bout of diverticulitis. So I live with a tendon condition that had me needing a wheelchair for a pretty long period of time, about something like 18 months, 16 to 18 months. Took me years to rehabilitate from that. I still have about 50% use of my hands compared to a typical person because of this tendon challenge that I live with. And I got that from taking a needed medication to alleviate the diverticulitis that I was experiencing. So one day, pretty soon after the second bout, uh, the first one that triggered all this was in 2011. And then in 2020, towards the end of 2020, I got it again. And if we think about what was happening in 2020, right, there was a lot of opportunity for stress and for me to not take care of myself in terms of nourishment or rest or hydration or exercise. Like I was at the absolute end of my tether, um, and not taking care of myself and still trying to show up for others from a really empty cup. And anyway, I ended up getting diverticulitis again. And so I'm out of the hospital. I'm home. I'm trying to understand what changes I need to make and, you know, just encountering lots and lots of emotions. And one day, Jay, who at the time was 16, got up and sort of swanned into the living room, munching on, I believe, a piece of white bread or something that was he was calling breakfast. And I like made him, it was such a trigger for me. I made him go into the kitchen and like choose, like go through the cereals or whatever and find. I remember saying you need the X, I don't remember what it was, but you need a certain amount of grams of fiber or you're not leaving this house basically. Like I was so caught up in my own fears for him. And he went off and started to do it. And he was not happy with me, but he obeyed. And I don't know, not long later, maybe 10 or 15 seconds later, I went in and I said, I apologize. I said, I didn't have these words yet that are talking about today, but I said like, I I am recognizing that because of what I've just been through, I'm not coming from like a good place. So please don't count the fiber and do all the stuff if you don't want to. And I really sincerely mean that. And I remember him saying at the time, like, that makes me kind of want to actually do it, which was lovely. But anyway, um, like I changed and stopped doing things like that. In fact, the way that has shown up in a really great way is um, we now have this idea of dashboard indicator lights, right? So if this hasn't happened, well, it does occasionally still happen because I still have times and moments where I'm not, at my best. But it's really gently handled now. So it doesn't have the same like blow up feeling that did, right? Where I will say, I've said to the kids, like, if you notice me giving advice to you that you did not ask for, like if there's any sort of pressure being put on you to behave in a way that doesn't feel how you are behaving or want to behave, like please know that that means that something's going on inside me that I need to go and sort out. And I would really appreciate it if you would bring that up because I don't A want to, be giving advice that nobody wants, and B, I would like to it's a great dashboard indicator light that I might not be seeing or noticing myself. And that's happened several times. Which is great because it means that nobody's having to, you know, I don't know, uh, just bite their lip and accept advice from somebody else. And also I'm sorting out what's going on for me, right? For myself. Like I can go and figure that out. Whereas prior to that, and it's definitely happened this way that I didn't know I wasn't in a good feeling state. Uh, I just wasn't in touch with those kind of emotions, right? And so, in those moments, it was lovely. It's been lovely to hear, are you okay? Because you're giving me advice and you've told me to mention that, right? So, a long, long way from you will do this how I want you to do it to like appreciating someone who's reflecting back to me what I had asked them to so that I can go sort myself out. That is what it means personally for me to be the one Jekyll. No one else has to change or do anything. Um, as long as I am choosing to make those choices. And I mean, really, what's happened is it's been returned to me so beautifully because once I stop making assumptions or giving advice or whatever, once I get curious about what's going on for somebody else from a place inside myself of feeling good, um, it's opened up the space for really wonderful conversations and really wonderful support that is just on my part being a good listener. I mean, I love that. Like, ooh, so it's so nice. So that's chapter one. And the ending meaning there is like not having to rely on anyone else to do this. We can do this just by ourselves if we want to, if we make that choice. I love that. And chapter two is called Compatibility is Only a Thought Away. And George starts off by talking about how we're told, or not we're told, but there's this sort of in the zeitgeist is this idea that like, well, we're just not compatible. I mean, I remember a whole entire movie called Irreconcilable Differences, which was about like a family splitting up, and I feel like like this young daughter was suing both parents to not live with either of them because of irreconcilable differences. Like we have this, there's a lot in our culture about incompatibility, and so here's what George says. I'm going to read a little quote. It is this: the issue is never the size, number, or even the nature of differences. The determining factor will always be whether you think those differences are important. Like just taking that in, right? It doesn't have to do with how many differences you feel. The compatibility or incompatibility isn't based on that at all, like the size, the number, or the nature of the differences. And he digs into some really interesting stories as he's going through this chapter. And the determining factor is always that exactly. What is the importance that you place on it, right? Like in this book that I was talking about, Red Side Story with the first book was Shades of Grey and the second one is Red Side Story. They live in the hierarchy is called the colortocracy. And everybody puts so much emphasis on like complementary colors are not even allowed to touch or talk to each other for more than a moment of like a pleasantry exchanged in the street. So what complementary colors are is colors on the opposing ends of the color spectrum, right? So reds and green, people who see red and people who see green are like, it's completely taboo for them to have any sort of relationship at all. Same with yellow and purple, people who see yellow and purple, and people who see orange or blue, like, because those are the color relationships. Like, it's completely absurd. But in that culture that is in these books, it's the fact that everyone thinks that that's what's important, right? So everyone thinks that this is a difference that's really important. Oh, you see red, well, you can't talk to this person who sees green. Like, fascinating. One of my favorite stories in the whole book occurs in this chapter. So what George does is he takes case studies from his therapy practice and shares them. And he talks about how like obviously names and identifying details are often changed. Also, sometimes it'll sound like one therapy session when really it was several. But anyway, it's fascinating to hear what comes up for people. And one of my favorite stories, as I say in the whole book, a woman comes to see George, and what she says is, my husband's in jail. Like, I think I need to get a divorce because my husband's in jail, something along those lines. And George has these thoughts, sort of an expectation that what she's going to say is like, I can't bear not spending time with him. I want to, find a different partnership where I'll be able to actually be with my partner, right? And instead, she doesn't say any of that at all. Instead, what she says is, she says, I'm really happy with my husband. Yes, of course, I wish we could be together for more than this, but I love him and I'm happy with him. And I'm here because I'm hearing from lots of people in my world that I shouldn't be with him because how can I possibly be happy? And in fact, as they're talking, as they're going along, George shares that one of the things she says is she's got one friend who's happily married, who's in like a happy partnership. And that everybody else who, all the advice that she's getting that she needs to leave this guy and whatever is all coming from people who are not in happy relationships, except for this one person who's who's, you know, great about her choosing to stay with her husband in jail. And it's just fascinating, right? It's how we feel about what works or doesn't work that matters. It's not the circumstances themselves. And I just listened to, I put this in my notes. There's a wonderful podcast called First This. It is part of so Catherine Nicolai is the creator of that. She's also the creator of the Nothing Much Happens podcast, which is like stories for all ages uh, to help you go to sleep. I love these shows so very much. And first, this is a 10-minute mindfulness and meditation practice. Comes out weekly. And one that I was just listening to, actually just this morning, was called "It Only Has to Make Sense to You." Like whatever the practice is, whatever you're doing inside, she's basically, Catherine Nicolai is saying, you don't have to justify it to anyone. Like you can just live it if it works for you. And, the lovely idea too that when you see someone who is trying to justify something to you, you can know that it doesn't have to work for you as long as it works for them, as long as what they're, wanting to create works for them. So it kind of works both ways, right? Like it only has to make sense to us. We can mind our own business in this way, right? Um, so this chapter 2 is about compatibility being only a thought away, right? So the idea that uh differences don't matter except as we make them matter. Maybe another way to think of it is when there's a sea of magic markers and your 3-year-old only wants the particular red magic marker that their sibling is using. No other magic marker will do. It has to be that one. And that's a thought. I mean, right? That's kind of like this. So, uh, I'm just looking down at my notes because I want to sort of be sure to bring attention in this chapter to what felt right. So, um, there's a conversation about seeing the people in our lives as quote a hassle, like, um, and because of the things that come up, we can. And in fact, there's a really interesting uh, therapy session that he kind of, or several therapy sessions that George takes us into in this one, which are about a couple who he wants a child and she doesn't. And it's like this big, huge deal in their relationship. And they both have very good reasons for what they want, and they're having a really hard time seeing the other's perspective. And after quite a bit of conversation, what George does is he invites them to spend the time between this session ending and the next one beginning, just not addressing that at all, just setting it aside, just being together and simply enjoying each other's company. And so 2 weeks goes by and they come back in and first thing he says, of course, is like, how was it? How were these weeks? And both partners talk about how like for example, the husband who wanted children talks about how he was having a much better time thinking about, for example, coming home from work because he knew he wasn't going to get a hassle about what might be said or not said about this big, huge issue between them. And then um, his partner, his wife, shares something similar, basically about just being comfortable being around her husband. And as this kind of unfolds, what happens is they each of them, and I believe this, he talks about this happening over several sessions or several months probably, is that at some point the wife says, "You know what? I've been really feeling babies this week. Like I really am much more open to this idea now, and I don't understand this." like I was so adamant, right? And the husband says, I'm also beginning to understand the perspective of someone who doesn't want children. And he says something like, I was realizing that the baby or the thought of a child was kind of a placeholder for your attention, he said to his wife, because he was feeling like uh, their relationship was getting less good, and the solution would be to have a child. And instead of that, what he's understanding is that it's lovely to just be with this person, with this human, and appreciate her. And she's feeling that way too. And so both of them, because they've spent time now, uh, what they've really done is they've spent time sort of away from this issue, and they each have a different perspective on it. And really, that's where this chapter kind of wraps up. Is like, uh, it's about being like good good feelings and good relationships can be accessed by being able to get some perspective and some distance from what's challenging in the moment. And so like spending the time understanding, when thoughts and feelings come up about what we want, we can remember, oh yeah, that's a like feelings are a barometer for an emotional feeling state. So once we know that, we can simply wait, right, until we're in a better feeling state and then engage on it. But in the meantime, we can just be with that person. We don't have to be continually bringing up issues or whatever. And that's, you know, being able to get some perspective and some distance on the challenges and instead focus on the enjoyment of the relationship. That's really where chapter 2 kind of wraps up. Um and that's where we're going to wrap up too. Because those were the chapters we were going to talk about today. I would be so curious your thoughts on what we've talked about today. If you've read the chapters of the Relationship Handbook that were in question, I would be so fascinated and curious to hear your thoughts on that. So uh, the letter K at klockculp.com. Or if it's easier, you can go to klockculp.com/contact and message me with questions, with thoughts, with observations, with if you think this is like how could this possibly work? I mean, I would be super fascinated to hear what your thoughts are on that. And I'm really, really grateful that you are here with me. And so we're going to in a couple of weeks from when this drops, so the third Tuesday in October, we will be discussing chapters 3, 4, and 5. So the other request that I have is if you read those chapters and you want to share your comments and thoughts or questions on them, uh, let me know. Do that too. I'm going to be sharing about this episode in LinkedIn, in Instagram. So you can find me there, and I'll probably post a clip, and that'll be a place for conversation as well. So thank you very much for being here with me. I am working on a shift, I guess is maybe what I will say, uh in the name of our podcast and in how I wrap it up. After more than 9 years of saluting the husband of the year, who he's always the husband of the year. He is our former producer, Benjamin Culp. Um, what's happened is I've discovered that I can mix it, I can produce it. I've got lots of support from Ben, from our son Jay, who's also in audio engineering. And I've sort of been feeling like, what if we wrap up in a different way? So I'll get to that in a moment. Before I do, I wanted to invite you to, well, all right, I'll do it. I'm going to share what the new name of the show will be. So I don't know when exactly this change will happen. It'll probably be towards the end of this year or new year, but it's going to have the name Art, Creativity, and Well-Being. Because I mean, some of you were around when it was We Turned Out Okay, right? Like, and that was great and fun. And then there came a moment where it just didn't feel quite right anymore. And It became Practical Intuition with K. And what's happening, I think, is that art, creativity, and well-being is sort of that's what Practical Intuition has grown into, for me, with me, inside myself, but also in what I do and how I lead and show up in the world. And so, in addition to this podcast, Art, Creativity, and Well-being is what it will be called. I've been creating a publication on the Substack platform, and what Substack does is it gives you the opportunity to share posts that are written, to share pictures, to share videos, to share live events. I mean, to do all kinds of really interesting things from Substack. And so if you go to klockculp.substack.com, links in the show notes, you'll see that you can sign up for Art, Creativity, and Well-being, which is every week. It's a couple of things. So it is a free weekly art share, um, where I share a piece of art and a story behind it, or some reflections on it, some things that have been true in my life, and some of the challenges that come up around creating art or well-being. Um, it's been such fun to create. And yeah, that's how it settled into a weekly art share that comes out every Tuesday. It is free to sign up for. And I'm also doing, this coming Thursday will be the first of our autumn, what I'm calling our autumn curriculum over there. So I wrote the memoir Waking Up, which is about how I grew to love my body and myself while solo hiking across northern England. And I there were these really important tools that happened, that were created. I mean, I co-created them really. Some of them maybe even got created simply by me. But anyway, uh, all of them I learned on my learning journey, and there's 7 of them that I highlight in the book. And I'm taking folks into paid supporters are getting access to an autumn curriculum of uh, videos diving into each tool and like the well-being that happens with the tool and how it can be utilized, how I've utilized it. Such fun with that. I am definitely bringing these tools into the free art shares that happen on Tuesdays. And then if you want to go more in depth, so you can sign up for that simply for free, right? And if you want, and thank you for the support, because that's one of my favorite things about the Substack platform is I feel so supported when someone gives me their attention, in the sense of now the Tuesday shares heading right into your inbox. And then if you choose to pay to support me, then on Thursdays or alternate Thursdays, plus Halloween, there will be a video kind of expanding on one of the tools, how it's been useful, how it might be useful for you. And it's a true community where people can comment and share their thoughts. And um, it's such fun. It's just such an interesting and diverse way to build community, create community, and to connect with other people. And that is what I'm all about. So, yeah, if you would like to be a part of that, click the klockculp.substack.com link, and I'll see you over there. Mm. All right. Thank you so much for being here. Um, at the end of each show, I share something I'm grateful for. And today, I am feeling a ton of gratitude for the walk that I took this morning, and the birds that I saw on my walk, and the route that took me through this really interesting kind of wild place. This morning, some of the birds I saw were these geese, looking like they were in sort of a migrating pattern and like chatting to each other as they're flying through the sky. I am so fortunate to have this place right near me in a what is a pretty typical, I think, suburban area. You don't often see just a big open wild place. It has the name the Sand Pits, and that's kind of what people around here call it. And it is such a beautiful place, and it's got this name. But I think what that's done is it's made it so that you have to get past the name to go there and realize the wonderful piece of and wildness of it, which maybe that's not such a bad thing. Although I wish more people would discover it because they could enjoy it, but anyway, so that's what I'm grateful for. Curious as always what you're grateful for. So if you want to share that, we've talked a lot about the places where you could do that. I'd love to hear. Um, thank you so much for being here, for your attention. I hope this has been a useful one for you, and I look forward to hearing questions, comments, thoughts. I'm excited for this book series, and I'm really, really glad that you're along to read this book with me, with us. Talk about community. Thank you so much for being here. We will see you next time.